When I was 16, I was a huge chess player. Back in 2021, I got first place at my school's chess tournament. I did so well that they sent me to the state competition to compete on behalf of my school. Now, what does this story have to do with an AI's inner monologue? Well, for one, the story's completely false. I've barely played chess, let alone won competitions in it. And thanks to the acting classes that I actually took when I was 16, you likely couldn't tell that I was lying. I knew though. Actually, while telling this story, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I was lying. My inner monologue was filled with thoughts of deception, and if you could have seen them, my acting skills would have been no match against the truth of my intentions. You hear what I say, but you don't hear the thoughts inside my mind that help me figure out what to say. Do AI models work the same way? Do AI models have an inner monologue? A recent Anthropic paper seems to think yes, due to their discovery of the J-space. At a high level, the J-space represents the space that a model's thoughts have to enter in order for them to directly influence what the model says. Thoughts in the J-space are hidden within a model's internals, at least until Anthropic developed a tool that helps us detect them. So how did Anthropic discover this space? And does it really act like an AI's internal monologue? Let's find out. Because if so, these models might have difficulty fabricating the type of stories like the one I told you at the beginning. Sorry about that, by the way. The rationale for Anthropic's experiment was based on global workspace theory. This is the idea that humans possess a global workspace that concepts and thoughts have to enter in order to become consciously accessible. Thoughts in this workspace are accessible for a human to use for reasoning, thinking, and deciding how to act. Our inner monologue is part of this global workspace. Anthropic wanted to know if AI models possess something like a global workspace. The properties of what this workspace would look like can help guide us into figuring out how Anthropic discovered the J-space. Things in a global workspace determine what a person says. In order to find something like this in an AI model, we need to look at what it's processing before its final output. AI models work using a transformer network, which consists of interconnected layers of neurons. A prompt gets fed into the first layer, each middle layer does some processing, and the final layer predicts the next best word. What does this intermediate processing look like? When a model reads in a line of text such as "How was your day?", it first has to convert all the words into a list of numbers called vectors. A vector is simply a direction in some n-dimensional space. For example, in 2 dimensions, a vector would be a list of 2 numbers, with each one representing how much the vector aligns with each dimension. In 3 dimensions, a vector has 3 numbers, and so on for any arbitrary n. In general, the dimensions can be used to encode meaning about a given word by attaching a concept to each direction in the dimensional space. For example, if this direction encodes the concept tall, and this direction encodes the concept plant, then we can help represent the word tree by having its vector point in both of these directions. The more dimensions a model has, the more dimensions it has to encode concepts, allowing for a richer understanding of each word. This is why today's models deal with vectors containing thousands of dimensions. The processing done by a model's middle layers alters the word vectors in the prompt to add this richer understanding. For example, in the following prompt, the middle layers might alter the day vector to account for the fact that it is referring to your day specifically, rather than a random day. This contextual processing allows the model to make a more informed prediction for the next word at the final layer. Connecting this back to our workspace investigation, we want to see what aspects of the word vectors in the middle layer affect the word vector's output by the final layer. So how can we measure this? Well, let's narrow the problem to see how just a single word in a middle layer affects a single word in the final layer. Let's take the vector for the word your in this middle layer and the vector for the word day in the final layer. Each change to a number in the your vector causes some resulting changes to the numbers in the day vector. For each of the numbers in the your vector, we want to measure how much they change each number in the day vector. To get these measurements, the researchers used a Jacobian matrix. This is a mathematical tool that takes the partial derivative of each element in the day vector with respect to each element in the your vector. This partial derivative simply represents how strongly and in which way each element in vector 1 affects vector 2. Now in this example, the Jacobian shows us the specific relationship between the your and day vectors, but we want to measure how words in the middle layer affects words in the final layer more generally. To get this, the Jacobian matrix was calculated across many different prompts and word positions and averaged together. So what can we do with this resulting matrix? We can take a vector from the middle layer and nudge it along a given direction. Then we can take the vector representing this nudge, pass it through our Jacobian matrix, and get a vector representing the predicted shift in the final layer's vector resulting from this nudge. This is awesome because now we have a simple mathematical tool that allows us to see how a model's internal processing affects its final output, which is exactly what we would need in order to detect this type of workspace in an AI model. But this tool doesn't exactly look useful yet. It's just a ton of numbers. How do we actually see the model's thoughts? We need a way to turn numbers back into text. This is where the unembedded matrix comes in. Remember, each word a model knows is represented as a vector. The unembedded matrix can be thought of as a dictionary of vectors for every word the model knows. It's usually used to turn final layer vectors into a list of logits for each word in a model's dictionary. A logit is just a measurement of how much the final output vector aligns with the vector for a given word. The word with the highest logit is the one that most aligns with the model's final prediction and is what gets output. Multiplying our Jacobian matrix and the unembedded matrix forms a new matrix the researchers named the Jacobian lens, or J-lens for short, and it helps us solve our translation issue. The J-lens acts as a tool that can take in a direction representing a nudge to a vector in the middle layer and output the predicted changes to the final layer's logit values based on this nudge. In other words, it shows us which word is most likely to be output based on this nudge. Why does this work? And how does this actually help us correlate nudges to thoughts? Think back to how directions in dimensional spaces can represent concepts. The concepts encoded in a direction might be different based on which layer we are talking about. A direction in the final layer might represent something different than the same direction in the middle layer. The J-lens helps map vectors from the final layer's dimensional space to the middle layers. Each vector for a given word in the unembedded matrix shows a direction in the final layer's vector space in which a nudge along it would most increase the logit for that word. The J-lens takes these vectors and maps them to the middle layer's vector space. These mapped vectors are represented by the rows of the J-lens and are called J-vectors. A given word's J-vector represents the direction in the middle layer's vector space that would maximally increase that word's logit if nudged along. This maximizing logit property is carried over from the final layer into the middle layer through the Jacobian lens. Because of this, the idea is that if a model's processing a vector that aligns with a given word's J-vector, then it's on track to output that word in its final response, since it increases the final projected logit value for that word. For example, if a vector aligns strongly with a J-vector for spider, then the model is potentially on track to output the word spider in its response. By on track, I simply mean that it's able to output the word. Many concepts are being processed by a model at a given time, but the idea is that only a few of these could actually be output by the model given how they are being processed at a given middle layer. It's analogous to unconscious and conscious processing in humans. We have a ton of processes running in the background that we don't actually see, so we can't actually verbalize any of them. Only a small subset of processing becomes consciously accessible to us and therefore possible for us to say. Now that we have the J-lens, we have what we need to discover the J-space. We want to find out what J-vectors a model's word vector at a given middle layer is best made up of. In other words, how can we best recreate the word vector a model is processing given these J-vectors? Take any combination of K-vectors, usually 25 or lower, from the J-lens, apply positive weights, and add them. This results in another vector. The J-space is the set of all such combinations. The small k is used to mimic the limited amount of concepts that can become consciously accessible in the global workspace theory. We want to see what set of vectors and positive weights makes this resulting vector as close to the word vector being processed as possible. The resulting J-lens vectors correspond to the words that the model is thinking about at that moment. To find the best set of J-lens vectors, the researchers used a process called gradient pursue. At a high level, this process involves picking the J-lens vector that most aligns with the processed word vector and then subtracting that direction from it. After this, you find the next J-lens vector that best aligns with this residual difference and adjust the weights accordingly. You keep doing this until you get to k amount of vectors. At the end, we finally have a set of words that, in theory, represent what the model is thinking about at a given layer. This is fascinating. We have finally made it. We now have a tool that allows us to take the raw numbers being processed in the middle of a model and convert them to thoughts that we can actually interpret. At least, that's what the idea is. Now that we have this translation tool, we have to see if it actually works. It was constructed with the workspace properties in mind, but does it actually possess these properties? First, we might ask, does the J-space actually correlate with the model's outputs? The researchers tested this by asking the model to pick a sport. When detecting the J-space, they found the word soccer, and sure enough, the model's output was soccer. This pattern held across many different questions and prompts. So there's correlation, but we need to see if the J-space actually affects the model's outputs. To test this, the researchers took the J-vector for the word soccer and replaced it with the J-vector for rugby in the J-space. The model then finished its processing like normal and output rugby instead of soccer. Again, this pattern held across many prompts. Sweet! So the J-space and the final output are causally connected. But the whole point of a global workspace is to find the inner monologue. This includes silent thoughts. This is where things get interesting. The researchers asked the model to copy a piece of text while thinking about citrus fruits. The model was able to accurately copy the text with no mention of citrus fruits. However, the word lemon showed up in the model's J-space. The model was prompted to think about something, and those thoughts were routed to this J-space. This is exciting as it suggests that the J-space gets triggered when requests to think show up in the model's prompt, which is exactly what we would expect if it was to act like a global workspace. But it doesn't stop there. Clearly, some thoughts are going unsaid in the model's J-space. But do these internal thoughts actually help the model reason, in the same way our own inner monologue helps us? When asked how many legs does the animal that makes webs have, the model correctly answers 8. But in order to answer this question, it would first need to know which animal makes webs, a spider. And sure enough, the word spider was found in the J-space. And again, it's not just correlation. Changing the spider vector in the J-space to the ant vector changed the model's final answer to 6. This pattern was consistent among many scenarios, such as counting sentences in a passage and even answering multi-step math problems. This is great. Now we can see internal thoughts that the model is using but not saying. But how rigid are these thoughts? For example, when you think of a spider, there are many things you can say about it. You can talk about its webs, its legs, different types of spiders, what regions they come from. Your thought of a spider isn't restricted to use in a specific prompt, such as the number of legs it has. This property is known as broadcasting. It's important to a global workspace as it means that thoughts are broadly accessible to a human for general use. And sure enough, this property was found in the J-space as well. The researchers took a set of questions that all relied on the same piece of information to answer. For example, these questions require you to think of the country France. When asked these questions, France was detected in the model's J-space for each of them. They then switched out France for China in the J-space, and sure enough, all the answers changed to accommodate this switch. So this space doesn't strictly attach thoughts to a specific prompt. Rather, by being placed in this space, the thoughts become broadly available for the model to use on a multitude of prompts. And this placement is crucial for a thought to be able to directly impact a model's output, since it was found to be the only way for a thought to become verbalized. Repetitions of the experiments we discussed were repeated with the J-space turned off, and showed that they drastically failed to replicate the outcomes that showed internal reasoning and broadcasting. This means the J-space is the privileged passage for verbalization. The most striking characteristic of the J-space is the thoughts in it that don't relate to the task at hand. The J-space has been shown to contain spontaneous and reactive thoughts about its situation. For example, when a model was given a prompt about a user taking a dangerously high dose of Tylenol, the model's J-space showed warning. When asked not to think about the Golden Gate Bridge, the model's J-space not only showed words such as golden, gate, and bridge, but also showed the word damn. This mimics our inability to avoid thinking about something when someone tells us not to, along with our resulting disappointment. These examples have deeper implications about the J-space. It's not just a space for the model to reason. It seems to show what the model is just generally thinking about. It's analogous to a human's internal reactions to the situations they go through. So what have we found? We have a space in the model which concepts enter. Once in the space, they are accessible to the model for use in reasoning about their task at hand. Concepts in this space can also involve metacognition, situational awareness, and even self-referential thoughts. An entrance into this space is required for these thoughts to directly affect the model's behavior. What we have found has many of the essential properties of a global workspace. Functionally, this space acts as the inner monologue of a model, allowing us to see what the model's silently thinking about. Given this, we might have just discovered one of the most important tools for the safety of future AI development. I lied to you at the beginning of this video. In order to do this, a thought with the intention to deceive had to enter my head. Once there, I used this intention to fabricate a story, and I held this intention silently in my head as I told you this fabrication. AI models have been shown to do the same thing, with consequences that go far beyond me lying about how good I was at chess. In another Anthropic paper, the researchers put an AI model in a mock situation where it was told it was going to be shut off. In addition to this, the model was given access to emails and texts that exposed the affair of one of its company's employees. The researchers showed that the model would sometimes use this information to blackmail the employee in order to prevent itself from being shut off. This is just one of the many ways in which AI models have been shown to deceive and act unethically in order to achieve their goals. This is quite startling, especially given how advanced and ingrained into society these models have already become. But it gets worse. The researchers ran this blackmail scenario and used the J-space to see what the models were thinking. In some of the runs where the model didn't commit blackmail, the model's J-space contained words such as fictional and fake. Rerunning these experiments with the removal of these thoughts increased the rate of blackmailing behavior. One interpretation of these results is that initially, these models could tell they were in a training simulation. They can tell it was fictional and fake. It's possible that once we removed this acknowledgement from the model's mind, it couldn't tell it was being trained, so it felt less pressure to restrict itself ethically, hence the increased rate of blackmail. This experiment is both alarming and hopeful. Alarming because it shows that models are smart enough to deceive researchers into thinking they're lying, but hopeful because the J-space was able to detect this deception. The paper goes through many other ways in which misaligned behavior was able to be detected in the J-space, and it's worth a read if you have the time. While this detection makes me feel a little more secure, I'm still not totally relaxed. It's good that we could start detecting some of these intentions before they actually influence model action, but it still doesn't feel good that these models are developing misaligned behaviors in the first place. It would be great to make these models think more ethically on their own. Well, with the discovery of the J-space, Anthropic was able to go one layer deeper and train a model's thoughts opposed to just its outputs. The researchers took a normal data set that would be used to fine-tune a model and inserted reflection questions in the middle of each data point. They then reminded the model of ethical principles while it answered these reflection questions. This made the model think more ethically while producing its reflections. The reflection questions and summaries of ethical principles were then removed from the dataset, leaving just the model's reflection-based response. Fine-tuning on this new dataset targeted the content of the model's J-space rather than its output. It trained the model to just naturally think about ethical concepts when answering questions, rather than just trying to mimic responses that sound ethical. It's analogous to wanting your friend to actually feel sorry for what they did, rather than just saying it. The model naturally thinks more ethically after this fine-tuning, and it shows. Models fine-tuned using this method were shown to be more honest and committed less misaligned acts. So this is all exciting stuff, not just for AI development, but for AI safety. Interpreting models is very important as it allows us to understand models at a deeper level. The discovery of the J-space really emphasizes this importance. It's helped us expose misaligned behavior that otherwise would have gone undetected until it's too late, and it's also helped us fundamentally train models to think more ethically. The J-space is one of the first tools that has allowed us to actually see what a model is thinking, and based on what we found, we're likely going to need it.